I'm talking today with Carlos Perez about his book, Artificial Empathy. He's a software engineer and author in the AI space. I found this book to be one of the most detailed and inspiring visions in the field in 2023. Enjoy our conversation. Okay. I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about who you are and what your background is in.
That's actually an interesting question, right? Yeah. So when I was much younger, I was thinking about what I'm going to do with my life. And I was thinking of what it would be the most relevant thing. And it was either the most relevant event that would happen to society or civilization. And I had boiled it down to two events. One was the discovery of artificial intelligence, and the other is the discovery of or being visited or first contact with aliens. And I sort of felt that, the latter, being first contacted with aliens or discovering life outside of planet Earth, would be, I guess, less within my own control or my own agency. So I decided, yep, I'm going to do artificial intelligence. So that was really one of the motivators early in my life. Although, I did start off in physics, but I eventually migrated over to computer science, and I've been doing things related to AI ever since.
Did you ever expect 2023 to turn out the way that it is right now? Are you surprised by the way things are now?
Actually, yes. I think yes. I'm extremely surprised. Actually, well, I first started getting really deep into deep learning back in 2016 or 2015, actually, and I wrote a book on deep learning entitled "Artificial Intuition: The Improbable Deep Learning Revolution." And in that book, I made the analogy that deep learning was a kind of artificial intuition, in that it was capable of learning through experience, or said in more technical words, amortizing inferences. So back then, okay, I was sort of like inspired by a kind of more centric or biologic centric approach in terms of how we would actually arrive at general intelligence, artificial general intelligence. And then in 2020, GPT-4 came along, and that really was surprising at what it was able to do from a substrate of deep learning. It was able to be somewhat fluent in its generation of natural language. And 2022 was ChatGPT, right? So that was a surprise. And 2023, right, early 2023 was GPT-4, which was a huge surprise in that it was able to show that it was able to self-correct its mistakes, which was surprising. So yeah, I think everyone was I think when GPT-3 came along in 2020, right? My feeling was it was that it lacked embodiment. So it couldn't reason about the world, couldn't reason causally about the world because it didn't have a physical body. It did not have agency in the world, right? So that so my thought was, okay, that's still going to limit progress in the field because, as hinted by Moravec's law, we would need more and more computation as we go down deeper levels of capabilities within biology. So my thought was, oh, okay, this is still going to be a problem, right? Because we don't have embodiment, and for some reason, right, they they were able to create GPT 3.5 or ChatGPT and GPT 4 without embodiment, without physical embodiment, right? And I sort of explained this in the book, that there's some kind of what I would call time travel or development, where where unlike biological evolution, we are able to introduce things in the future to accelerate development in the AI systems that we're building today. So I can explain that later. But that gave us what we have today, which is actually surprised actually most people. Most people, even in the field, like Jeffrey Hinton and Joshua Bengio, right? And they've always been working in deep learning, and now they're really concerned with the speed of development.
Mm, interesting. You'll see on Twitter, there's kind of these two sides that have developed over the past year or so. One of them is coined the doomers, and one of them is accelerationists. Do you want to weigh in on
Yeah,
what you're seeing in this area?
actually, I think it was 6 months ago when there was this paper for pausing AI and having GPTP. I guess OpenAI paused the training of GPT-5, right? And I did sign that letter, right? And at that time, my concern was that there wasn't enough conversation going on as to the risk of AI. So I signed it because I felt that the conversations weren't there, right? Then now 6 months later, the conversations are there, and several governments are talking about AI regulation, right? So I think AI regulation is a good thing because at least we're actually talking about potential risks. Now, with regards to the ideas of the AI doomists, right?
Doomers.
Doomers, right? Like Kowski. Yeah, I think it's a little bit exaggerated and it's problematic because it's really coming from a kind of worldview that is, I would say, driven by this notion of intelligence influencing the hierarchy of governance in the world. So if you're more intelligent and therefore you have the ability to essentially rule over the world, and I guess ruling over the world, and the people underneath don't have any agency, and we are at the whims of the rulers. I think that's one of it, but I yeah, from my perspective, I don't buy into the doomers from the perspective as that as intelligence becomes, as you move up in intelligence, you get a more enlightened perspective into the world, into civilization, into society, and that perspective like drives more equality and diversity or ensures equality and diversity in society, and that implies, right, a different worldview, right. So the worldview of an enlightened AI would be very different from the worldview that we see today that drives current civilization, right? So the problem with doomist philosophy is that the current worldview remains the same as intelligence becomes more capable, which I don't believe to be true.
Interesting. So that makes me think of spiral dynamics and how AI relates to spiral dynamics. Like you're talking about it, as AI advances, you would expect civilization to change
Yes,
as
I
well.
think
Is that
so.
what you're
Yeah.
saying?
Yes. Yeah. So there were two frames that I know of with regards to cognitive maturity. One is Keegan's stages of development, right? And Wilbur's, sorry, spiral dynamics. And they're somewhat related, right? In that, well, there are less levels in Keegan's model, right? But it's this notion that as we mature, our what I guess Michael Levin would call light cone of care starts expanding. So initially, we're just very tribal, and our care is within the concerns of the tribe. But as we gain more intelligence and more capability, it becomes more global, right? So our care is much wider. And in the same way, spiral dynamics tackles that, and it's got more finer details of levels. but it does reflect not just individual cognitive development as in Keegan's model, but also how society develops. I'm seeing that as AI develops, about civilization itself also develops. So there's some kind of inextricable intertwining of civilization and cognition itself. So as the population becomes more advanced cognitively through themselves and through AI, then civilization itself also becomes more equal and more diverse.
You talk about spiral dynamics in the book Artificial Empathy a little bit, right?
Yes, it's in that book. If I was to look at the book, I wonder where that is. Yeah, it's in the yes, it's in the chapter 11 under conversational empathy, right? So it's like if we think about, this book is about, it's subtitled The Roadmap for Aligned Artificial Intelligence. So it has a roadmap there, and that roadmap is somewhat aligned to the roadmap, spiral dynamics, or Keegan's model of adult development, right? And as you go to the higher levels, then you start to realize that cognitive development is intertwined with conversation and intertwined with society and civilization. So there's this feedback loop where cognition influences language and society influences language back, and language influences how we think. So there's this loop that's created, that we're in that loop with our language and our civilization. Someone would call it, in addition to biological evolution, we have cultural evolution. Right? So we invent new concepts. We invent concepts like democracy or free markets and that sort of thing, right? That's all part of cultural evolution. We invent language, that's part of cultural evolution. And that informs our own cognition. In the same way, you're going to see the same thing with artificial intelligence, right? As AI works on language, it develops new languages, and those languages feed back into it. So it thinks better, thinks more effectively in how it solves its problems.
Quick.
Is that in the interview?
That part right now in 2023, November 2023, it seems like it's hard to keep up with all of the AI news. And there's this term called the singularity that describes this exponential pace of change. And it's really hard to predict what's going to happen next at this point. Can you comment on your perspective of this idea of the technological singularity? Maybe tell us briefly what it is, and then can you tie that into, does the time period that we're currently in, did that encourage you to write this book, Artificial Empathy?
Oh, okay. Let's see. Yeah, I began writing the book Artificial Empathy in actually during the pandemic 2020, right? And yeah, I was driven by this hunch that empathy, right? In my book, I take a more abstract view of empathy, more aligned to the notion of cognitive empathy. That cognitive empathy would be like one of the higher levels of cognition that we're hoping to achieve in artificial general intelligence. So, and I had a roadmap back then. So that's what drove me to write the book, so that at least I could explain to other people how AI is making progress, or how exponential AI progresses, so that I could track the exponential progress of AI. So I would know by looking at the roadmap, where is AI going. That's how it actually gives me some sense of of how fast AI is moving. So if it hits the different milestones, then I can say, oh, it's accelerating because it's hitting these milestones faster than I expected.
You mentioned the brain not being like a computer in this book, artificial empathy. How should we rethink our approach to AI given this perspective? And can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it's a common metaphor that's used that the brain is like a computer. And I believe it emerges all these kind of incorrect metaphors about the brain being like a steam engine or a computer, right? Is usually driven by the kind of technologies of the day, and because the brain is complicated enough, we try to come up with metaphors to sort of like explain it. And the brain being a computer is one of the really bad ones, because when we think about computers, we're thinking about more like the CPUs that drive our laptops, or the components that drive our smartphone. And they tend to be essentially what one might call artificial logical systems. So they're very good at deduction. They don't make mistakes about deduction, because deductions really are driven by what one would call in computer science rewrite rules. So you're just basically transforming one expression to another using a fixed set of rules, right? And those fixed set of rules, normally they call them grammars. And that's what computers essentially do, right? They just run this narrow deductive inferencing method to get its results, and they're very useful for us. But when we're talking about something like deep learning, then we're talking about artificial intuition kinds of systems, which use a different kind of inference. We call it inductive inference. And that is, we're basically trying to match patterns to categories. So the difference is that the rewrite rules are actually learned by the intuition machine, or the artificial intuition. So that's how these kind of systems learn by iterating through its training data. So by exposing it to the training data, it recognizes all the patterns and eventually discovers the inductive rule as to what set of patterns fit within a particular category. So that's artificial intuition. And our brains are kind of like that, right? Because we don't have our built-in deductive rules. And yeah, one of the reasons why in the early days of computers that we sort of, or society had this notion that artificial intelligence would be solved simply through an artificial logic system or a deductive system, was that we have this bias in Western civilization, really pushed by Rene Descartes, which is this notion about I think, therefore I am, which effectively implies that how we separate ourselves from other, what they would call beast machines or other animals, is that we have reason. So they sort of believe that if we could do logic within a machine, then we would get basically artificial intelligence. But that hasn't really worked out after decades. And in the last 10 years, we invented artificial intuition based on deep learning, and that's why the notion of a brain being not a computer is along that. Our brains are more like intuition machines rather than logical machines.
Interesting. Beast machines. I like that. I've
Yes,
never heard that before.
yes, I think Anil Seth uses it a lot, but I believe it originally comes from Rene Descartes.
Interesting. What about, I've heard some people refer to AI as alien-like intelligence. What's your take on that?
That's interesting. Yeah, so the reason it might be alien is because the way these AI, when we say AI, the current generation, right, the GPT-4 kind of AI, is that their development path is very different from a biological development path, right? Most biological things have what I would describe as biological agency. So there's always this need to propagate itself and to survive and to be persistent. And there's this notion of self within these these biological systems. And that eventually manifests itself in cognition as consciousness. However, these GPT-4 like systems, they're trained in a different development path. So sure, they can mimic us in terms of our language skills. However, it developed differently. And that's why it's likely that how it actually thinks about things might be entirely different or entirely alien from how I think about things.
Hmm. Can we talk about triadic thinking? What does that mean, and why is it in your book?
Yes, triadic thinking comes from Charles Sanders Peirce, who developed this notion of semiotics, which is a superset of logic. And in triadic thinking, you're actually working with three concepts at the same time, rather than the more typical dyadic thinking, which only involves two concepts. So in triadic thinking, right, you can think about it. So you have three concepts, that's three ideas, and then you have the whole, so that's four ideas, and then you have relationships between all the three. So that's six plus one. So that's seven different concepts all at once, right? So that's sort of like is at the limit of cognition in terms of our short term or actually our working memory where we can only have 5 to 7 concepts simultaneously. And the nice so it does capture the limitations of thinking, meaning at most we can do triadic thinking. And the way Charles Sanders Peirce constructs all his concepts is through this notion of triadic thinking. We can, of course, think of other things like quadratic thinking, but that goes to a much larger space where you're talking about 28 dimensions, right? Or 66 concepts. So maybe a super intelligence might be able to do that kind of thing. But for now, I mean, triadic thinking seems to be sufficient. At the same time, the nice thing about this nice feature to triadic thinking is that it's composable. So you can build up concepts from that. So even though it's limited, you can compose higher concepts based on stitching together these triadic wholes.
So in the book, you delve into the complexity of neurons and the self-creating nature of biology. How does understanding biology inform our approach to artificial intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the only way that you can achieve general intelligence is that you actually have to grow them. So that implies that the ideas of biology of actually growing organisms, right, from single cells to an entire organism, right, is the only way they actually can get general intelligence. In fact, even though we don't actually grow the silicon for these deep learning systems, their training is actually some sort of abstract growing, right? Where they grow from initial training set into a fully fledged language model that is eventually able to competently handle text, right? So there's this notion of growing that is abstract. So this is in contrast to the original good old-fashioned AI, where AI wasn't actually grown, right? It was actually programmed, right? The problem with programming is that it's propositional knowledge that is applied to an agent, and that agent doesn't know where those propositions come from, doesn't know how it learned it, so it doesn't know how to be adaptive. So it never learns to be adaptive. It just follows the proposition, and that's always been the flaw with good old-fashioned AI, in that it was always brittle because there is always an edge case in terms of logic, and when you get to that edge case, because you don't know how you actually derived it, right? You've never experienced how that came about. Then you don't know how to resolve that kind of discontinuities.
So you're talking about embodiment, about AI being embodied, right?
Yeah, actually, yes, that implies an embodiment. And when we think about something like GPT-4 that isn't embodied in the more traditional sense of having a body, right, in the
Hmm.
physical 3D world, right, then yeah, we can say it's not embodied. On the other hand, within its own world, which is that world or that universe or that environment of language, then it's embodied. But it's not embodied in the same sense that biological creatures are embodied, but it's still immersed in that world because it's manipulating words, right? And can see how the words change through its manipulations, right? But it's not embodied in the sense of being able to actually sort of like manipulate a 3D space.
Hmm. What about in a virtual context, though, like in Minecraft?
Yeah. So they've actually applied GPT-4 in Minecraft and it's done pretty well. So yeah, so you just have to give it the environment. It's possible, right, that they'll be fluent in that environment, right? But there are different kinds of environments and different kinds of intelligences. So you might think that, for example, the immune system might be a kind of intelligence. It's not the same kind of intelligence as the human brain, but it's intelligent enough to cure itself of infections, right? But that kind of consciousness that a immune system might have, it would be entirely different from that of a brain.
All right, I'm gonna ask you. Roadmap for AGI is outlined. What are some major milestones you see on this roadmap, and how close are we to achieving them?
Okay. Yeah. So let me at least explain the structure of the book. So the structure of the book is that it's got 12 chapters, but the four chapters are really introductory material. So we talk about biology and semiotics, triadic thinking, and knowledge, and that sort and knowing. And then the remaining chapters talk about the actual different levels outlined in the roadmap. So there are essentially 6 levels, and they're all broken up into different chapters. And the first level is what we call these intuition machines, right? Intuitive learning, right? So we have these deep learning systems. And the second level are these dual process kind of systems that, such as GANs, for example, generative adversarial networks that are responsible for a lot of the very realistic faces that were created, that were generated. This was a couple of years ago. And also for things like AlphaGo, which is a kind of neural network system that played against itself, right, to learn. That is the generated itself. And then why is it like that? Okay, sorry. I'll have to cut that out. Oh, and then the next ones are what we call dual processes, right? And these are systems that are sort of like adversarial to each other. No, strike that. Dual process systems are systems that are cooperative with each other. So they coordinate different perspectives. So we can think of systems that might have rationality and intuition, and they would coordinate between those two. Or sort of like, I guess, the brain where you have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. One is holistic and the other side is or symbolic, and they coordinate to solve problems. Or systems that do self-play, right? So those are these dual processes. And then after that is at the next level is these things we call interventional causal reasoning systems, right? Which what they do is they intervene in this world, and through its intervention, through their participation in the world, it discovers causal relationships and it builds up a causal model, right? So they build up world models of reality, and they use that world model to further reason about the world. And then at the next level is these counterfactual ingenuity systems. There's a counterfactual ingenuity, right? And what we're talking about here is systems that can discover or invent their own counterfactual models, so new ways of modeling things, and then using those new models, right, to actually understand the world in greater depth, right? So, and then the next level after that is what I would call conversational empathy. So these are systems, right, that are excellent at conversation and therefore understanding the theory of mind or the intentions of other cognitive agents. So these things participate in conversation, and therefore they need to understand why other agents are actually conversing in a particular way, and then basically inferring what to do next, right? So it's a little bit more sophisticated, and this is where empathy comes from, right? This cognitive empathy, where we're trying to anticipate the reason of why someone says something, right, or behaves in a certain way, right? So those are the 6 levels of in the roadmap, right? And these levels help in understanding where we're at in the current stage of AI or AGI development. In fact, I've actually used these levels, and I had GPT-4 ingest the levels, and GPT-4, interesting enough, identifies itself as being in, I believe, level 4, right, which is this interventional causal reasoning level, which is interesting that it can actually even self-evaluate. So
And you
that's
think that's an accurate evaluation?
it seems to be accurate enough. Yeah, I think it is accurate, right? I don't think it currently. Yeah, the next level above that is the being able to create contractual models, and I don't think it's able to do that yet, right? It understands the models that we give it, right? The models that have invented, right? And if you give it to GPT-4, then it's able to reason with it well, but to conjure up something new, right? An entirely new model on its own. It hasn't done that yet. So it's not yet at level 5. And then level 6 is an entirely new level, which is you're not only conjuring up new models, you're actually inventing new languages.
Hmm. Do you have any intuition as to how long it could be until
It's
we
very
see
hard
those?
to make these kind of predictions because we know what the goal is, but we don't really know what the intermediate path would be. So
Mhm.
we definitely see acceleration in development, right? But the it's not straight acceleration. It's more of like we accelerate and then we hit a plateau, and then we're in that plateau for a little bit for a while, and then we explode again, right? And then the explosion is really fast. So we could say, like,
Mhm.
for example, deep learning begins with artificial intuition, and then so that would be 2012 until 2017 we're still in artificial intuition, right? And then by 2017 we come up with these things called transformer models, which give us essentially artificial attention, right? And that explodes from 2017 to 2020, which is around 3 years, right? And then from 2020 to 2023, right? Also, no, 2017 to 2020 is about 4 years. So it's roughly about 3 years or 2.5 years to GPT-4. So we're now GPT-4, we're in November, maybe about 9 months past, right? And so I do expect some breakthrough sometime in 2024, right? To some other level, right? Is that level artificial empathy? I'm not sure yet. It could be something else, right? But yeah, so there's something brewing. Something will explode in somewhere late 2023 or early 2024, just based on this notion about the time for development keeps decreasing, right? It keeps
Mhm.
getting halved, right? So you can think about it. If you look again, think about it from 2012 to 2017. That's 5 years, right? From deep learning to transformers. And then 2017 to 2020, that's GPT, that's transformers to GPT-3, right? what GPT-3 gave you was this few shot learning, right? You didn't have to train the system again. You just put everything in the context. That was roughly about 4 years. And then GPT-3 to GPT-4, right, which is roughly slightly less than 3 years. So maybe the next one is maybe around 2 years, right? So 2025 or 2024, right? What will it be? Yeah, I suspect it's some sort of ability to create abstractions. So it is that next level that we're talking about, this counterfactual reasoning. And then after that, maybe there'll be another year, right, to get you to the artificial empathy or the conversational kind of thing that I'm anticipating in the book.
Okay. And so, yeah, you're describing this exponential nature of the pace of change. And of course, when we're dealing with exponentials, it's extremely difficult to predict what's next. But I do still want to ask you, because you touch on various topics like economics of abundance and creative destruction in the book. And I want to ask you, how does AI intersect with these broader societal and economic concepts?
Let's talk about creative destruction, right? So I guess in the progress of any technology, we get to a point where we have first diminishing returns. This is where it starts plateauing. And then we have the notion that not only do you have diminishing returns, is that the technology has already become detrimental to civilization, right? So, for example, fossil fuels, right, an oil-based economy, right? It wasn't an issue in the early days, right? So when there was not a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? But as we started using these fuels, burning these fuels more and more, right, we had more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and it is the cause of global warming. So there's a limit to being able to use that kind of technology, right? So we get to a point where the technology becomes detrimental to our future, and that's where we need some sort of creative destruction. That we're not going to use certain technologies that got us there, right? We essentially destroy it. It's kind of like what they have in computer science circles or software development circles as reducing or removing technical debt, right? Technical debt is the kind of stuff that you in the development of the system, and then you realize eventually over time that, oh, we don't need it anymore, so we got to throw it to get to the next level. In the same way, creative destruction is something like that, where we need to remove stuff that we relied on to get to the next. So we see how society will progress, right? There's certain times that we have to stop doing certain things to get to the next level.
Okay, so that said, what role do you think AI will play in shaping the future of civilization?
If we think about civilization, the predominant philosophy of civilization is one that I would call as being substance-based, as opposed to another philosophy would be process-based. So at the time of the Greeks, there were different philosophies. One of them was process-based, which originated from Heraclitus, and he's the one who had that quotation where no man steps into a river twice, because when he steps in, right, he's another man, right? So basically emphasizing the notion of everything being a process. But everything being a process is problematic from the civilization building perspective, because that change is the norm, rather than with the notion of things being static, which is a substance-based philosophy. So civilization propagates itself by having people believe in the status quo, that things don't change, so that kings will always be kings, monarchs will be always monarchs, norms will always remain the same. They are sacred things. So that creates a level of stability such that civilization can last for a significant period. But as we move towards this exponential changing environment because of technologies and AI, then we have to change our philosophy. Philosophy now that starts to begin to adopt the notion of process or change being centric to our worldview, as opposed to things being remaining static and not ever changing. Because we know things are changing and they're changing very rapidly. So we have to embrace this kind of new philosophy where change is the norm, right? So what that means is that civilization itself has to change its underlying philosophy to being one that is change oriented, that's being process oriented, right? So that I see as being the biggest, the most radical change, right, to civilization that AI brings to the table, right?
At least in the West is what I'm hearing, because
Well, the East has also adopted a lot of the Western traditions, right? In terms of so the East has a different philosophy that tends to be more collective versus individualistic, and a lot of the notions of a change-oriented philosophy that informs their a lot of their religions, like Buddhism and Hinduism, and so that's quite related to this process philosophy. However, governance in the East tends to not reflect that kind of philosophy, right? And it's simply because it's often the case that authoritarian mindsets, right, tend to take over the or dominate over more egalitarian mindsets.
Mm-hmm. So would it be fair to say we could expect change to be a norm, like more change, more diversity,
Yeah,
less
so this question,
predictability?
how does that come about in a world where we've been so accustomed to the status quo, not actually ever changing? How do we actually make that transition? And how does AI itself be a catalyst for how does AI accelerate it? And what I'm seeing now is that AI, especially as indicated by the advances that we have for language models, is that AI allows us to think in deeper and more enlightened ways. So it's a very powerful educational tool. So it's what levels us up from different levels of spiral dynamics, from a red hierarchical system, from a blue truth-based system or religious system, from a orange individual achievement type of level, and then to a green collective organic kind of thing. So it's at every stage you need to level up to the next level, right? And that requires a different way of presenting material. And to do that at scale, right, you need, the kind of automation that AI can render. So, and that's how I see civilization itself leveling up through AI, because AI is probably the only tool that will give you that kind of education at scale.
What are some key takeaways you hope readers can gain from reading this book, Artificial Empathy?
For this book is a new perspective of viewing or seeing the changes that AI is rendering to our civilization, that we need to actually change our worldviews so that it's more organic and collective. That's the main takeaway of this book that I hope readers will pick up, is that I'm proposing a alternative perspective of civilization. So the main takeaway I hope readers will gain from reading this book is that I'm proposing an alternative perspective of how civilization should structure itself. And this restructuring, this technical debt removal, or this regeneration or creative destruction will require a change of philosophy, one that leans to an embracing of change, one that is more process oriented. And I think we need to go in this direction because this is the only viable way that we can ensure that the technologies that we develop is more aligned with our human needs. If we continue to go in the with a philosophy of a substance-based philosophy, one that emphasizes the hierarchical nature of civilization or the lack of diversity or the lack of equality, then we cannot avoid creating technologies that will be misaligned with the needs of humanity. So if you want something that is aligned to, if you want AI to be aligned to, then we have to start looking into how do we actually structure our civilization. Because this is not a technology problem. It's really more of how do we want society to be constructed.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
Thank you.
I agree.